But people of color participated in these churches, and their participation was not passive. They actively sought to remake colonial Christianity and have these churches serve their own interests.
It's my pleasure to introduce a speaker who we have known at the library for some time, and who I'm really excited to have the opportunity to actually find out what he found out there. Richard Bowles is Assistant Professor of History at Oklahoma State University, where he specializes in early American and American religious history. He received his PhD from George Washington University and his BA and MA from Boston College. Dr. Bowles researches race relations in northeastern Protestant churches from 1730 to 1850, and his first book manuscript, Dividing the Faith, The Rise of Racially Segregated Northern Churches, is now under contract with New York University Press and available in 2020, 2021, somewhere in there. This work examines the transition from racially diverse churches during the early 18th century to separate American Indian and African American congregations by the early 19th century in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. Dr. Bowles has published articles in the Journal of Rhode Island History and the New England Quarterly. This summer, a new article about 18th century African American Lutherans. It will be published in the Lutheran Quarterly. I will look for that. His research has been supported by a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grant, an Alfred J. Beveridge grant, a Gelder Lehrman Research Fellowship, an American Congregational Association Boston Athenaeum Fellowship, and a Massachusetts Historical Society Fellowship, and other grants, apparently too numerous to mention. So it's a pleasure to welcome Richard Bowles.
I especially want to thank the Old South Association and the Congregational Library for sponsoring this event. These organizations, as you know, do such vitally important work in preserving and educating so many people about American history. I'm grateful, I'm sure we're all grateful for the generations of people that helped preserve this magnificent building and the opportunity that we have to learn here. I especially want to highlight, I think in part because she's too modest to highlight it herself, two of the really significant things that have happened at the Congregational Library under Peggy Bendroth's leadership. The first is the Hidden Histories, New England Hidden Histories Project, led by Jeff Cooper, who's also here. This project has digitized enormous amounts of 18th century church records and papers from ministers. And they're now available online, they're being transcribed. It's such an important work of preservation and making history more accessible. And so a lot of the images you'll see in the presentation today, including this one right here on the title page, came from the digitization work that the Congregational Library and the New England Hidden Histories Project has done. And also this month, the Congregational Library is starting renovations on their 14th Beacon Street headquarters. And I can't wait to come back again to do research and attend events when the library renovations are done. They're really going to be spectacular. Considering that this meeting house was her church, allowed me to begin tonight's talk by addressing enslaved African-American woman Phyllis Wheatley. How many of you are familiar with the basic outline of her life and events? Yeah, as I suspected. She's well known. Let me review some of the details for those who don't remember or are not familiar. Phyllis Wheatley was stolen from her family in Senegambia and transported by European slave traders to Boston in 1761. She was about 7 years old. The Wheatley family who purchased her and gave her both of these names treated her far better than almost any enslaved person in the 18th century. She received a thorough education, even learned to read Latin, and she began writing poetry in about 1765. Often it was religious in content. In this very meeting house where we now stand, Phyllis, quote, servant to Mr. Wheatley, was baptized by the Reverend Samuel Cooper on August 18th, 1771. As many of you might realize, this baptism happened less than 3 years before the meeting that preceded the Boston Tea Party. So she's living in Boston in a very tumultuous and exciting time. She continued to attend church here at Old South on a regular basis. In July 1772, she wrote a letter and explained that she'd been ill and was staying in the country, but that she, quote, came to town this morning to spend the Sabbath with my master and mistress, end quote. In the following year, some of her poetry was published in London as a book titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. The fact that we have this likeness of her, this image, is evidence of her exceptionalism. Her experience is unique. There's no other person like her. In her experience, her accomplishments, she stands out. But Phyllis Wheatley was metaphorically just the tip of the iceberg in terms of African American affiliation with Northern churches. In fact, in that one regard, Phyllis Wheatley is ordinary, when in every other way she's extraordinary. Thousands of African Americans and hundreds of Native Americans publicly participated in and affiliated with Northern churches during the 18th century. However, the history of these churches and the African Americans and Native Americans who participated in them has been whitewashed. Historians have known about Phyllis Wheatley and some other black church members. Many of you know about Phyllis Wheatley and probably a few other black church members. But Phyllis Wheatley and others are often treated as outliers, again, exceptions in the narrative of American religious history, in the narratives of New England's colonial history. New England churches, especially Congregational and Anglican ones, were commonly interracial. Almost wherever there were people of color in colonial society, they participated in the central institutions of these communities. And this fact alters how we should think about colonial New England. As I'll make clear, these churches were interracial, but not integrated. These same churches implicitly and often explicitly justified slavery and justified the dispossession of Native American land. But people of color participated in these churches, and their participation was not passive. They actively sought to remake colonial Christianity and have these churches serve their own interests. So in addressing this topic tonight, I have sort of three questions that are going to guide my talk or organize my talk here. So in what ways and to what extent did African Americans and Native Americans participate in 18th century New England churches? 2, what motivated or caused African Americans and Native Americans' involvement in these churches? And sort of related, or in other words, we could say, what did these churches mean to them? What did church participation mean to these people? And how did African Americans and Native Americans actively shape New England churches and religious life in this century? I've already sort of given you the short answer to number one, that interracial worship was more common in New England churches than has been generally assumed by historians. But before I explain how I know the extent of interracial worship, let's imagine that we are in New London, Connecticut, on a cool fall evening of Wednesday, October 29th, 1738. On this evening, church members and congregants are converging on the New London Meeting House to attend the midweek lecture and to witness several baptisms. The meeting house in New London was not all that different from the meeting house where you now sit. As the congregants came in, they took their seats in the high-walled box pews, sort of like the ones where you sit now. Seating was a contentious issue in New London, as it was for many New England churches. A committee decided and determined where people could sit in the meeting house, and they determined seating based on a wide variety of factors. First of all, your ability to pay pew rental fees, but also by various factors including status, wealth, age, public service, family connections, gender, and race. There was such a high demand for seating at the New London Meeting House that a second gallery was added above the first, much like the upper gallery here. The congregation came in and, like most New England congregations in this time period, sang psalms without instruments, without an instrument or accompaniment. and listened to a well-prepared sermon from the Reverend Eliphalet Adams. On each of the previous Wednesdays in October, a child had been baptized. But on this particular evening, an adult named Phyllis and 4 children named Ishmael, James, Ziba, and Sylvanus were baptized. At the appointed time, Phyllis and the children proceeded towards the front of the church, likely descending a narrow stairway from the gallery. A lot like, I was just told, the stairwell over there on that side is original to 1729. So coming down a stairwell, much like the one over there in the corner. They walked toward the Reverend Adams, who was the pastor of the First Church of Christ in New London, and also the man who held legal title to these 5 enslaved people of African descent. By law and by custom, these 5 people owed Reverend Adams their lifelong labors and complete obedience. Phyllis stood in front of the congregation, much like I stand in front of you now. She owned the covenant, which is to say that she agreed that she believed in the basic doctrines of Christianity, and she agreed to submit herself to the governance and discipline of the church members. Now, she was already liable to be punished in any way by her master, but now she's agreeing that she could be censored or excommunicated for moral failings by the members of this congregation in New London. After she made this, owned the covenant, made this profession, she was baptized. And following that, next, Phyllis's children, James, Ziba, and Sylvanus, were baptized, as well as Ishmael, who was the child of another one of Adams's slaves. Adams promised to educate these 4 children in Christianity as part of his responsibility as their metaphorical patriarch, a role typically assumed of English masters of bonded laborers. For Reverend Adams, the sacrament of baptism was a sacred duty performed regularly for children of believing parents and adults who made a profession of faith in Christ. Infants, children, adults could all receive the sacrament either on the profession of adult, their guardian, or by making a profession themselves. Adams baptized a total of 57 people in 1738. For this Phyllis, the meaning and significance of the baptism are unclear, as the historical record gives us no insight to her words or her thoughts. Perhaps Adams used means ranging from persuasion requests to threats to convince her to be baptized. Or perhaps she wanted it herself and sought after it for her own reasons. We just don't know. Although a minority in the New London Church, Phyllis and her children were hardly the only non-white worshipers. In the 1730s and 1740s, 16 Native Americans and 15 African Americans were baptized at the New London Church. Among them were the Mohican sachem Benjamin Oncas II, the leader of the Mohican people, and several of his family members. His reasons, of course, are very different for why he's affiliating with the church than some of the other people of color. These baptisms were a small but noticeable minority of the hundreds of baptisms performed at the church during this era. Much like these examples, people of color from across New England joined predominantly white churches as individuals and in small groups throughout the 18th century. Collectively, they were making these churches more representative of the diversity of British colonial society. So between the 1730s and the 1790s, before separate black churches were formed in the North, black men, women, and children were regularly connected to these predominantly white churches. Moreover, Pequot, Narragansett, Mohican, Wampanoag, and other Indians participated in predominantly white churches in growing numbers in the 1730s and 40s. And I have to recommend Linford Fisher's book on the Indian Great Awakening for a more detailed treatment of that subject. In congregational churches across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and southern Maine, African Americans and Native Americans were not only attending, but also were being baptized and admitted to communion and full membership. So I've identified over 121 congregational churches that included multiple African American or Native American baptisms in the 1730s and 40s. Out of my sample of churches, in the case of Massachusetts, I found only 14 congregational churches in those years which did not have multiple identifiable black baptisms. African Americans also participated in Anglican churches, starting in the early 18th century. During the 1730s and 40s, black people were baptized at Anglican churches in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Newburyport and Marblehead, Massachusetts, Boston's 3 Anglican churches, and Rhode Island's 4 oldest Anglican churches. Some of these Anglican churches also included Native Americans. So this map, which you also have on the handout I provided, shows the locations of the Congregational and the Anglican churches that I identified in the 1730s and 40s with multiple identifiable Black or Indian members or baptisms. The map shows approximately 140 individual churches, but because a lot of those churches are in the same town, sort of some of these dots are representing multiple congregations. While some congregations in New England only baptized 1 or 2 Black people in the course of a decade, other congregations baptized 10 in a year. These differences were often related to location. Blacks and Indians were most prevalent in the churches of port towns and communities located near Indian land reserves. So you can sort of see, obviously, coastal regions are the areas that have the highest numbers of African Americans in the 18th century. Colonial cities, major cities of Boston, Newport, Hartford also have the highest ratios. But these baptisms also appear across the entire region settled by Europeans during this period of time. Well, again, I've indicated that in some of these cases, we only have a couple African Americans being baptized. But I would make the case that it's significant in some contexts that even we have just a few African American baptisms. And let me make this point by looking at the Second Church of Christ in Amesbury, Massachusetts. In Amesbury, only 1 Black child and 1 Indian child were baptized in the 1740s. And 4 Black children were baptized there in the 1750s. So a small number, not very many. However, we need to understand the context. Amesbury had an estimated population of only 5 African Americans over the age of 16 in 1755. And it had multiple congregational churches. So we don't know for sure how many people participated out of the whole population. But given those numbers, it seems likely that at least half, if not the overwhelming majority, of the Black people present in this town were affiliated with, in some way, one of the congregational churches. I can make this claim because I've examined the records in so many congregational churches. For my whole study, I've looked at 450 different congregations. Obviously, those are through the Mid-Atlantic states as well. The church records often note baptism, members, marriage, and death, and they reveal trends in Black and Indian participation and affiliation. Let me show you some examples. These are from Old South, from 1741, part of the baptismal list, indicating the people who were baptized here during the era of the Great Awakening. You see racial notations, which makes this type of study possible. It also, the racial notations, of course, are a sign of the unequal status that these people were afforded. Anyone who is not a white male is indicated sort of in relationship to a white male in these records, including notations like widows, daughter of, son of, servant of. Phyllis, Indian servant, here near the bottom, it says Phyllis, Indian servant of Timothy Pratt, and Peter, her son. We don't know exactly what the status meant. Given the 18th century context, Phyllis could have been a hired servant, an indentured servant, or a lifelong slave. There were Native Americans who were still in lifetime servitude in New England in the middle of the 18th century. Here's another example, and both of these images are from the website where you can go and look at records yourself, the New England Hidden Histories website, digitization project. In this case, at the very bottom, the last line of this page, the minister notes the baptism as follows. December 26th, the minister wrote, "My Negro man, Tony, made a confession of his former evil and sinful life and declared how God had met him and was baptized." African Americans and Native Americans participated in many of these churches in substantial ways. Anglican churches, on average, baptized more African Americans than Congregational churches throughout New England. It's not a stretch to say that black people always affiliated with New England's Anglican churches. They did so by being baptized, by taking communion, and by attending catechism classes and by being married by Anglican ministers. Trinity Anglican Church in Newport, Rhode Island, was always the Newport, Rhode Island congregation with the highest rates of African American baptisms. In fact, during the 1760s and 1770s, Trinity Newport baptized more African Americans than all other Newport churches combined. There's approximately 51 black baptisms between 1764 and 1776, and at least 21 of these people were adults. And this is important for noticing that unlike most of the English people who are affiliated with the Church of England, most Anglicans are baptized as infants, right? That's the normal process for most Anglicans. But such a high percentage of these African American baptisms being adults indicates again that these people are encountering the Church of England in a very different manner, in a different way than most of the Anglicans in this period of time. Several Connecticut churches, particularly those near Mohican and Pequot reserves, had high numbers of Indian participants in addition to some black congregants. Groton, Stonington, New London, Lebanon, Old Lyme, Hebron, Newark, Connecticut were places where Indians were most active in participating in churches in the 1730s and 40s. Before many of these Native Americans decided to stop affiliating with the churches in the late 1740s and 1750s. Got ahead of myself a little bit there. These are locations of the Anglican churches across the north that baptized African Americans in 1764 to 1776. So stretching all the way from Queen's Chapel in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, stretching down all the way to Philadelphia, Christ Church there at the bottom. You see throughout the region along the coasts, the major cities, the Connecticut River Valley, Anglican churches across the entire north, not just in New England, are baptizing substantial numbers of African Americans throughout this period of time. Trinity Church in New York City has the highest rates of baptisms of African Americans of any congregation across the entire north. That's known as Trinity Wall Street now. They had probably a couple thousand African American baptisms, but most of the records burned in 1776, so it's a little hard. You have to base it on missionary records to figure that out. So as I was saying, most Native Americans in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts stopped affiliating with predominantly white churches in the 1750s. And one of the strong reasons for doing so was that they had ministers of their own who could lead churches in their own communities. They were often located some distance away from white communities, and so in places like Mashpee, Massachusetts, Narragansett, Rhode Island, Mohican, Connecticut, the Shinnecock and Mohawk reservations on Long Island, you had Native American ministers like Samson Occom, some ordained and some not ordained, leading Native American churches. Having already experienced these the white churches, many of them decided that they could practice Christianity just as easily, if not better, on their own. Samson Occom was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1759. Both before and after that, he is serving as a teacher and a community leader, a pastor, a missionary. Sometimes he's working for white missionary organizations. Other times he's working independently of white missionary organizations and serving the communities that he called home. So as a result of the rise of separate Indian churches in the 1740s and 50s, we see a substantial drop in the number of Native Americans who are affiliating with predominantly white churches. Only small numbers of Indians affiliated with New England's predominantly white churches in the 1760s to the 1790s, and those Indians who are still participating in those churches tended to be servants in white households far away from Indian reserves and Indian churches. On the whole, there were fewer African-American communicants, fewer African-American communicants than there were African-Americans in the pews and African-Americans being baptized. This isn't really surprising, though, because for white people as well in the 18th century, far more people attend church, far more people are baptized than become communicants. And there's several reasons that are affecting both populations. In general, in the 18th century, ministers warned people about the dangers of taking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. It was dangerous, deadly even, for your soul for you to take communion if you weren't spiritually right with God, if you weren't in the right place. Most churches didn't take communion very often. Even Anglican churches only did it 3 to 5 times a year, not every week. Those factors combined make it less often that anyone takes communion. Moreover, in some churches, you had to testify to your spiritual condition. You had to get up in front of the congregation and convince the members that you had been reborn, that you'd experienced grace, and therefore were ready to take communion. And that public testimony made it more difficult to access that sacrament than it was for baptism. So a lot of people stayed away until they were later in life, when thoughts of approaching death were more prevalent, and at that point, later in life, would seek to become a communicant. Now, there's also, for African Americans and Native Americans, the added burden of being a minority in these churches. That is also a hindrance to approaching communion. White Christians placed severe limits on the participation of African Americans and Native Americans in these churches. Women of every race and poorer white colonists were not treated as equals to white men of high status either. Women were the largest category of people who could not vote in church business, in church discussions, but black men and Indian men were also excluded from the male privilege of voting in these churches. This corresponds with their exclusion from the body politic. Usually, Native Americans and African Americans could only sit in designated portions of the meeting house. That usually meant the far back corners or the corners of the gallery, sort of as far away from the minister as possible. Sometimes, some churches who are extremely filled with people, African Americans are forced to sit in the stairwells or sometimes listen from outside the window, although that seems to be a little bit rare. So there's severe limitations. Old South voted in 1730 a couple of resolutions about seating. One of them was that Old South was going to pay someone to, quote, have oversight of the children and the servants in the gallery. So they're hiring someone to supervise children and servants servants certainly includes enslaved people who are sitting in the gallery. They also voted that, quote, in honor of His Excellency, our governor, there be a canopy erected over his pew. So the governor's pew, I just checked the display over there. Governor's pew was right back here, sort of opposite of the pulpit, near the door. His pew was designated with decorations, right? They put a canopy over it to show his status, right? So all of the social hierarchy of colonial society is displayed and reinforced in the seating arrangement. You know where you stand in the hierarchy of colonial society based on where you sit. And so that low status that black people and Indian people occupied in colonial society is reinforced every Sunday or every time they're in the meeting house. The Congregational Church in Sheffield, Massachusetts in 1733 voted, quote, that the hind flank seat in the upper gallery on the north side, and that seat and that only be for the black people to sit in. No denomination until late in the century would ordain any African Americans, although occasionally during the revival services, sometimes African Americans would preach. So again, given that I've just outlined all the ways that prejudice of colonial society and really even the institution of slavery are reinforced by these churches, reinforced by these seating arrangements, why did they participate? Why did African Americans, why did Native Americans participate in so many of these churches? The short answer is that there were a wide variety of reasons, including spiritual, educational, and social reasons that are promoting church attendance and church affiliation among these people. Traditionally, many scholars have emphasized the Great Awakening, the religious revivals of the Great Awakening, as a reason, as the cause for African American and Native American participation in churches. People of color participated in the revivals initiated by George Whitefield, Daniel Rogers, James Davenport, and other ministers, particularly in the period of 1741 to 1743. Here you see an image of George Whitefield, and you also see the published form of a poem written by Phyllis Wheatley, lamenting, really, the death of George Whitefield in 1770. So we know, it is clear, that African Americans participated in the revival services, that many of the revival ministers actively sought out and wrote about the African Americans and Native Americans who participated in the revival meetings. Phyllis Wheatley clearly felt some sense of respect, admiration for George Whitefield with this famous poem that she published, that was published for her. However, emotional revivalism was not the only or the most important cause. And we can look at this from several different ways. One is that African Americans and Native Americans joined churches before the revivals happened. And they continued to do so long after the revivals ended. But I think even more to the point, they're participating in churches whose leaders denounced George Whitefield and who opposed George Whitefield. Right? So they're really participating in all types of New England churches, the revival-focused churches and those staunchly opposed to the revival. I know this is hard to read. This is why it's also on your handout. So you take a look at the chart. Looking at the Boston churches from this time period will help explain what I mean by their participation spread over the whole range of types of churches. So African Americans affiliated through baptism and becoming a communicant in the two congregational churches most associated with the revival. Old South and Brattle welcomed George Whitefield. He preached in their meeting houses, and African Americans joined those churches in fairly substantial numbers in the 1740s. So here you can see that Brattle Street baptized 46 African Americans and Old South 35, which were relatively over 4% and 3% of the total baptisms during those years. The numbers drop quite a bit after the revival ends. Numbers in the next period of time, which is again a shorter period of time, but look at the percentages too. There's sort of a decline, right? There's fewer African Americans joining in the next period of time, and for one of them, the percentage of black baptisms is decreasing as well. So just looking at this, it would seem to suggest that the revival is having an impact. The revival is helping encourage African Americans to participate in these churches. And certainly for many, the revival was an important part of why they affiliated with these churches. But again, if we go back to all of the churches, we notice, can anyone tell me what church had the highest number and the highest percentage of African American? Anybody notice it on your sheet? Christ Church, the Old North Church, as it's known now, had 55 African American baptisms in those years. The minister of Christ Church denounced George Whitefield, did not like him, did not support the revival. Yet higher number and higher percent of total baptisms happened at that church. Also, if we look at the citywide totals, we notice that in the period of 1750 to 1763, the total percentage of citywide baptisms that were African Americans goes up slightly as compared to the period most associated with the Great Awakening. Again, so if revivalism and the Great Awakening can only partially explain the reasons for African American and Native American affiliations, what other factors motivated other people? Many of these Black and Indian people affiliated with white churches because pastors and congregants actively ministered to them at times when they were searching for spiritual meaning for their many worldly ills. Right? It's common sense. Right? Having difficulty, having hardship, someone ministering to you plays a crucial role. Although their options were severely limited and restricted by the confines of slavery and colonialism, some Black and Indian people seemed to find spiritual fulfillment in these churches. Phyllis Wheatley's private correspondence, especially with Obor Tanner, another enslaved African American woman, give indications that some people found spiritual fulfillment in these churches. When sick, Phyllis Wheatley said that she was comforted by, quote, him who declared from heaven that his strength was made perfect in weakness. In a 1773 letter to Englishman Don Thornton, Phyllis Wheatley commented that God was no respecter of persons, being the maker of all. God, she wrote, therefore disdains not to be called the father of humble Africans and Indians. Though despised on earth on account of our color, we have this consolation. We could also consider the case of Cuffee and Anna Wright as examples of people who found some measure of spiritual fulfillment in these churches. 86 people joined the Middleborough, Massachusetts Congregational Church between 1745 and 1777, including a man named Cuffee, later known as Cuffee Wright. Cuffee was owned by the Reverend Sylvanus Conant, the minister of this church. He was baptized and joined the church as a full member on March 1773, following a public profession of faith. And remarkably, his public profession has survived in the church records. Wright said that, quote, Christ is precious to my soul. When I'm about my calling and business, I find many passages of Scripture that comfort my soul, and my mind has been comforted with things of the netherworld. Sin is grief to me. Christ is precious to my soul. In particular, he noted Psalm 119, verse 71, which says, it is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. It's hard not to think of that verse in relationship to him being an enslaved man, having to labor for someone else his whole life. Cuffee indicated, I'm not 100% positive on whether this is his handwriting or not. Yeah. Cuffee Wright believes that he was unworthy of God's mercy, but he was grateful that God brought him, quote, out of the land of darkness unto the land of glorious gospel light. Now, statements about sin and unworthiness like this are very typical of professions from this era. So it's not, the language here is not sort of, most of it's not tied to him as an enslaved person, but again, very common language in these types of professions. Cuffee likely faced pressure from Conant and joined the church while he was not free. We can't lose sight of that. Enslaved men and women in the North were compelled to labor for others. Some of them were compelled to attend church and compelled to listen to religious instruction or to adhere to Christian morality. But that does not necessarily mean that Cuffee Wright or anyone else was compelled to be baptized or compelled to join the church. Cuffee's status as a church member may have helped convince Conant to free Cuffee in his will. And Cuffee Wright gained his freedom in 1777. Shortly thereafter, he took the surname Wright and married a black woman named Anna. Anna joined this church as a free woman in 1796. Anna expressed gratitude that she was, quote, born and brought up in the land of gospel light, and my parents gave me to God in baptism. But she also lamented how she had long neglected to build upon this good foundation. She came to be concerned about her soul and the danger it faced. She eventually found relief from this sense of sinfulness and described how, quote, the Lord in mercy has, I hope, appeared to me, and comforting biblical words came to me. Examples of worshiping at churches, there are several examples of African Americans worshiping at churches that were not the church that their owners, their master and mistress, attended. And again, an interesting sense of some agency within slavery in some cases. In 1736, the minister Timothy Cutler of Christ Church described, quote, a Negro servant to a dissenter who from great irregularities is become a serious and sober man. This enslaved man, we don't have his name, unfortunately, was owned by Congregationalists, but he has chosen to participate in the Church of England instead. How that played out, I don't know, but he made it happen. An enslaved black man named Nero Benson, who was owned by the minister of the First Congregational Church in Framingham, Massachusetts, joined the Hopkinton Congregational Church instead of the church of his master. Apparently, Nero Benson did this because he had a theological dispute with the minister, the man who claimed to own him. Black baptisms at the two Congregational churches in Newport, Rhode Island were on the rise during the 1730s, and the major cause of this increase was clearly the ministry of Sarah Osborne. Several hundred people, both black and white, met at Sarah Osborne's home on a weekly basis and participated in a religious revival that she initiated. She faced opposition from some of the town's ministers as a result. Right? Women were not permitted to preach in any of these churches at this time period. I highly recommend Catherine Breakfast's book on Sarah Osborne for more detail about that remarkable woman. One of the people who attended the meetings at Sarah Osborne's house was Obor Tanner. After attending these revival meetings, after interacting with Sarah Osborne, she ends up joining the First Congregational Church in 1768. Obor Tanner was a slave of James Tanner, who was also a member of First Church. Again, the revivalism, the evangelical work done by Sarah Osborne spurs an increase in the number of baptisms and members at all of the churches in town, particularly the two Congregational churches. But still, to gain access to baptism, to get access to communion, these people still had to go through the minister, the male minister of these churches. Second Congregational Church, Newport, Rhode Island, led at this time by Reverend Ezra Stiles, is also actively ministering to the town's enslaved population. Ezra Stiles also catechized, baptized, married, and admitted to membership some of the black people in Newport in this time period, including a person that he claimed to own. Another person who joined this Second Congregational Church was a slave owned by the governor. The records say, quote, Phyllis, here's the third Phyllis, Negro servant of Governor Linden and wife of Brother Zingo, was baptized and admitted into full communion in the public congregation. So this woman is joining her husband, Brother Zingo, is already a member of the congregation. Stiles led weekly catechism classes at the church, and black children almost always attended these weekly catechism classes with the white children at this church. Trinity Church Newport, as I mentioned before, has the highest rate of African American baptisms in Newport. And it's also a good example of what may have drawn many African Americans and some Native Americans to these congregations. Across the north, the Anglican churches are holding classes specifically designed to teach African Americans how to read throughout the 18th century. Trinity Church is operating a charity school funded by the Bray Associates of London, and the church also had a lending library. In 1771, 30 children were enrolled in this charity school, and they were being taught how to read, how to write, how to sew, and other skills. In 1774, there were 38 black children attending the school here. The last names of the masters who sent these enslaved children to the school match many of the last names of the black people baptized at Trinity Church. Rhode Island's sort of unique in that in public records in Rhode Island, this is the only colony that did this, black people always have last names. Almost everywhere else, there's no surname attached to an enslaved person. But in the records, enslaved people in Rhode Island have surnames. It's usually just the master's surname, but sometimes it's different. So means of obtaining practical benefits, such as education, as well as religious motivations, affected attendance at these churches. In 1765, the vestry of Trinity Newport voted to have the church wardens hire a room for a markador, quote, formerly a slave of Nathan K., deceased, set him free and pay his rent for 1 year. This enslaved man was an estate bequest to the church. Instead of using his services or selling him, the church made the decision to free him and pay rent for a year. This is remarkable. This is very rare. It was more common to have churches buy slaves as gifts for the minister than it was for a slave to free someone. But again, it's an example of a tangible benefit that could possibly be attained, that was occasionally obtained by a church. African Americans knew that attending a church gave them access to social power that they couldn't find anywhere else. They had tangible benefits such as access to education, access to white patronage, a place to socialize. Christ Church and King's Chapel in Boston in the mid-18th century gave some of their charity poor relief to free African Americans in Boston on a pretty regular basis. So the motivations were mixed. Both material and spiritual motivations affected these people. Not all that surprising. Church services were opportunities to see other enslaved friends and family members dispersed across the town. Educational opportunities for Black and Indian people were sought after. A degree of social status was conferred in the context of colonial America by being a church member. Christianity sometimes provided a positive identity for enslaved people. Help from a sympathetic minister was crucial for some Indians, or at least they sought sympathetic ministers to help them deal with legal disputes with other colonists. African Americans and Native Americans participated in so many congregations that their religious practices must be taken seriously. Black and Indian participation in Christian churches was not peripheral to Northern religious life. Rather, the widespread participation of Black and Indian people in colonial churches means that these institutions were not simply white institutions. The Black and Indian people influenced church leaders, influenced these congregations, and they pushed them to address the issues that they faced, including, and most especially, the issue of slavery. So let me address my third question and more briefly. African Americans and Native Americans participated in churches in ways that shaped those institutions and shaped the religious landscape of New England more broadly. This is a story of how people who were colonized and oppressed, by engaging in one of the major institutions of European colonialism, churches, and in the process, sometimes influenced those institutions and religious life more broadly. The most evident way that this happened, or the most widespread way that this happened, was that African Americans pushed white Christians towards anti-slavery views in the 18th century. Very gradually, very slowly, white Christians in New England adopted anti-slavery principles, first opposing the international slave trade and later opposing sometimes slavery itself. This was a gradual process. You see very small hints of it in the 1770s. It grows in the 1780s and grows continually into the 1790s and beyond. Eventually, New England gets rid of slavery. But that was a slow, gradual turn. Almost all white Christians before this point accepted that Christianity validated slavery. So it's a dramatic change in theology that had to happen for these churches to go from being supportive of slavery to opposing it. African Americans, of course, knew that Christianity opposed slavery earlier and are vocal and active in convincing these congregations where they're participating that the congregations and the ministers should oppose slavery as well. On March 29th, 1754, and I was talking about the 1770s and 80s and 90s. This is 1754. An enslaved Black man named Greenwich preached against slavery in colonial America in the Canterbury Separate Congregational Church, where both he and his master attended. This enslaved person used a sort of an analysis of Genesis, Exodus, 1 Kings, Jeremiah, and Proverbs to make the argument that slavery should be ended. Greenwich condemned how whites, quote, steal as many of them Africans and bring them into our country, your country, to make slaves of them, their soul and body. Really powerful connection there, right? The soul and body, pointing out the enslavement that is happening there. Jonathan Edwards Jr. used this same verse in a sermon against slavery 37 years later. All right? It takes time for white people to apply these same things. This is an enslaved man saying this in 1754. The faith that he shared with white churchgoers, he used the same faith to confront assumptions about slavery and race that most of the congregation took for granted. If Greenwich had not attended this church, there's no way that he could have used the church as an institution and this theology to condemn the slavery that he experienced. Right? His participation was necessary in this church to make this happen. Far from excluding further participation, he actually becomes a church member later. They don't kick him out, they don't censor him. He's actually sought after. They notice that he stops attending, and they set a committee to ask him why he's stopped attending church. And the following year, in 1766, he actually becomes a full member. But he doesn't gain his freedom until 1776. The participation in churches was really important for the development of African American abolitionist movement. And here I'm drawing some of this from Christopher Cameron's excellent work. This is a petition submitted by African Americans to the Massachusetts governor in 1774. In a petition the year earlier, Massachusetts enslaved people petitioned the legislature seeking emancipation. They testified to the injustice of slavery and referenced their religious beliefs. These petitioners cried, "We have no property, we have no wives, we have no children, we have no city, no country, but we have a Father in heaven, and we are determined, as far as his grace shall enable us, and as far as our degraded, contemptuous life will admit, to keep all his commandments." Of course, many of them are married, many of them do have children, but they are trying to highlight how slavery is keeping them from fulfilling their God-ordained obligations. In 1780, a group of enslaved black people in Hartford petitioned for freedom. They directly quoted 9 biblical passages and referenced several others. They had a detailed knowledge of Scripture and used that to critique slavery in Connecticut. These enslaved people told the legislature that they, quote, "pray to God that he would send forth his good spirit unto your hearts and remind you of your duty and make you instruments for binding up the brokenhearted and of proclaiming liberty to the captives." Bold words to the legislature of Connecticut. They made a strong connection between Christianity and emancipation, even though most white Christians still did not see those things as contradictory. We have an example of at least one enslaved man opposing racial segregation in the meeting house. In 1764, an enslaved black man named Lim in Litchfield, Connecticut, disregarded the racial and social hierarchy of the meeting house by repeatedly occupying a gallery pew reserved for white people only. He also disobeyed his master, who said, "You can't do that anymore." They even put a lock on the door of the pew. He jumped in anyway. This led to a brawl. Several young white men confronted Nim and basically threw him headfirst out of the pew. This resulted in several court cases. The first court case actually sided with Nim and fined the white people a few shillings for this public disruptions. The next court case overturned it. But he's clearly confronting the segregation that he's experiencing in this church. Once black and Indian people claimed the Christian faith for themselves through their participation in predominantly white churches, they grew increasingly insistent that they should be treated by their white congregations as Christian brothers and sisters. Indians, tired of discriminatory treatment, left churches in droves to form their own independent congregations in the 1750s. During the 1740s, many of the Narragansett Indians joined the predominantly white church in Rhode Island. But after experiencing prejudice therein, especially prejudice against one of their own who was preaching, the Narragansetts withdrew from that church almost en masse and started their own church. And they ordained Samuel Niles to be their pastor. This is the church building that they built for themselves in the 19th century. The 3 acres surrounding this church building is the only land that has been in the Narragansetts' possession for all of time. This is the 3 acres that they kept even when they lost everything else in Rhode Island. After 1790, unwilling to suffer segregation in churches, most Northern African Americans also withdrew and formed their own churches. Gradually, though, there's a period of time across the North when the number of interracial churches and the number of separate black churches are actually growing together. There's a period of time where there's some moments where both types of Christianity are growing together before you get a steep drop-off where almost all African Americans are in separate African American churches. The development of separate Indian churches, separate African American churches dramatically changes the religious landscape of New England. The religious history of New England becomes much more diverse as these different expressions of Christianity multiply across the region at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. In some ways, in an ironic coincidence, Lemuel Haynes became the first black man ordained during the same period of time when separate black churches are formed. Of course, this is the first separate black church in Massachusetts, in Boston, the African Meeting House, another very famous meeting house that I encourage you all to go visit. If you have not had a ranger-led tour of the Black Heritage Trail, you really, really ought to. It ends here at the African Meeting House and the African American History Museum. So at the same moment as African Americans are starting to leave predominantly white churches forming their own churches. Lemuel Haynes becomes the first African American ordained as a congregational minister. He's licensed to preach in 1780 and ordained 1785. He was born in West Hartford, Connecticut in 1753. He had a black father and a white mother, and he was indentured. He was taken away from his parents and indentured to a deacon of a congregational church nearby. When he was 5 months old, he was taken to Granville, Massachusetts. Through his youth, he had to labor hard through the day, his biographer writes. Eventually, he experienced a sense of conviction for sin and hope for salvation and was baptized and became a member in the First Granville Congregational Church. He served in the Revolutionary War as a soldier. He studied theology in 1779, 1780, and when a new church was organized in Middle Granville, Massachusetts, Haynes was invited to supply their pulpit. According to the 1837 biography written by a friend and fellow minister, quote, all classes and ages were carried away with the sweet animated eloquence of his preaching. He continued to preach there for 5 years and married a woman, Elizabeth Babbitt. He serves as a minister of the Torrington, Connecticut church for 2 years before he leaves for Vermont, where he serves a white congregational church for 30 years. So to conclude, for too long, many educated people and historians have written about the colonial Norse churches as if there were no black or Indians present. On the contrary, most Congregational and Anglican churches in New England included people of color in the 18th century. They participated in these churches as attendees and through rituals of baptism and communion. Their presence was not solely the result of the Great Awakening, although that certainly has an influence. They participated in churches that were opposed to revivalism, and a mix of reasons, spiritual and material, likely affected their choices of when to participate and when not to. They found various types of Protestant Christianity appealing, and they shaped these churches in small ways that we will never know about because they don't appear in the historical records, and in much more substantial ways, such as in the development of anti-slavery Christianity in New England. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. I like the fact that you have all this data, but one of the questions I'm asking is on the other side. And when you talk about individual churches, they have kind of a catchment area, or they have a certain kind of congregant that may be bringing their servants or their slaves to church with them. And I'm wondering if there's any information that you have that explains maybe geography or socioeconomic status of the non-enslaved or native peoples that would influence the numbers coming from the other side.
Maybe somewhat. I go to Boston a lot because it's good for comparison, right? You've got a large number of churches with sort of different dispositions. You've got a city that we know quite a bit about. So I looked and tried to determine if the neighborhood mattered, where the church is located in the 18th century. We know that the North End had the highest number of enslaved people. Certainly concentrated in the North End, but the churches in the North End, apart from Christ Church, don't have much higher rates than churches located here or somewhere else. So when I looked at least the geography and what we know about who lived where in 18th century Boston, I didn't see a strong correlation between the location of the meeting house. I tend to think too that in 18th century Boston's so small. If you went to a different church, it's at most 10 more minutes of walking. So I didn't see a real strong correlation there. Certainly, if you're in a smaller rural town, certainly some of the people who are farthest from a meeting house, that affects attendance. That affects whether everyone comes, perhaps. But I don't have a real great source base for getting at examples of that. Thank you.
You spent a lot of, you made reference to a number of ministers, a number of churches who owned, and I'll use the word own, who had enslaved people. And you talked about at least what I understood you saying, the attractiveness of being a part of a church for an enslaved person, that it in some respects, it sounded like it opened doors for them, which I find very puzzling. But you did not talk about the justification of how that being baptized did not change one's status. You might have been free in Christ, but you weren't free in any other way. And I'd like, could you make any comments on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a crucial point. The English people settled that debate for themselves pretty early in the 18th century, that baptism does not change the status here on earth of anyone. But there was quite a bit of debate about that for a while. And African Americans, even after laws are created in various colonies that says baptism does not change status, African Americans continued to say baptism changes status, baptism matters. There's a petition from Virginia, first decade of the 17th century, to the Bishop of London that is saying, we are Christian, we seek access to the church, we deserve to be free. If you can't free us, at least allow us to have access to the church and access to education. So you brought up a lot of good points. The slavery is explicitly pro-slavery as it's being preached, as it's being articulated by ministers and by congregations in the 18th century until late in the century. And so that there is a puzzle, and I think that's right, that why do you participate in an institution that is part of the oppression that you're facing? And the churches are without a doubt part of the systematic oppression that Black people and Indian people experienced in colonial America. So I think, yes, it is a surprise that so many of these churches included these people. And I don't think, part of this too is before the revolution, everyone sort of assumed the norm was a hierarchical society, right? We're not, before the revolution, before you're claiming that all people are created equal, there's not that public claim for anyone to say, hey, well, what about me? Because no one is claiming equality. The norm is inequality. Everyone is subject to someone else. If you're not subject to your neighbor, you're subject to the king. So it is a hierarchical world, and I think within a hierarchical world, there are some calculations for how can I improve my status, how can I improve my life that are not equated to the question of slavery or freedom, but a realization of the society in which you live. So I think things like, but African Americans in the 18th century also realized that education, and Indians realized this too, that education was access to power, access to means of improving their condition, of eventually claiming that the scripture calls for freedom here on earth as well. And so that's sort of a roundabout answer, but I hope I've hit on some of the good points that you raised.
Hi, I'm Mary Gardner, and to me also one of the main questions is, well, why did they allow the Negroes, the African Americans, to come? And so I'm reading a book right now called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive Racist History of America, and it's broken up into 5 sections, each keyed off a particular person, and has a large section about Cotton Mather and the approach to religion and how it justified and supported and encouraged slavery by denigrating the African Americans who were being brought over. And in the beginning, in the introduction, he talks about different kinds of racism. He says there are the racists who just didn't like African American people and denigrated them for every reason they could think of. But there were also the people that he calls the assimilationists. And they're the people who said, if you bring religion
to the African American people, then they can get better. If you teach them to read, they will be better enslaved people. They didn't use that word. And so he makes the distinction. And some of that I'm hearing in your description also. But I found it so eye-opening, the section about Cotton Mather and how they came here with the idea of supporting slavery. They weren't slaves here at the time, so it was applied to the American Indians, Native Americans. I'm sorry, I'm 75. I've gone through so many permutations here, but I'm working on the most current. But anyway, so he applied it there, but then as the African Americans were being brought over, whether they were enslaved or whether they had been set free, there was still strong anti-racism, which you've hinted at, and I think is a really important point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your information. I was drawn to come here because of the title, and it's overwhelming in terms of the type of data that I'm discovering. But I have two questions, if you don't mind. My first question is the terminology that you were using throughout your speech, and it goes back and forth from slaves to African Americans to blacks, and I was kind of wondering, during that period of time, what was the most African American and black are pretty recent descriptions that African Americans, how we identify ourselves, but
Yeah.
when you're giving data about that, I got kind of lost in terms of the terminology from that time period. That's one. And
Yeah, that's a good question. The records throughout the 18th century, all the church records say Negro.
said Negro.
Negro,
And
without any, well, almost without exception. When you get the period of 1780 to 1820, then church records start changing. The church records, again, these are all written by white people. So the church records start changing and start saying black or African.
I'm sorry,
and then
that was in 1820?
Sort of 1780s to 1820s, the records often say African or black, or occasionally still Negro. After 1820, the records all say colored. And so by looking at the church records, you could see that racial categories, racial terminology is in flux. So this is difficult to talk about this history and to do so respectfully and with integrity, because the records that I'm talking about themselves were part of the process of making race. Right. These churches and Christianity were part of the process of making race and inscribing it with meaning in these contexts.
No, it just came to my attention because I was just taking it in the context of how we've grown to where we are and being factual. That was, but
yeah.
My second part was when the covering Native Americans and African Americans. I didn't hear during your conversation that at some of these churches, when there's the designated seating was up in the galleys or wherever, was there any kind of documentation that Africans and Native Americans sat together or intermingled in these, or was your data basically churches that just had black slaves, or was there any three-way intermingling?
I don't have any evidence for a separate enslaved African Americans and separate Indians. I think in the 18th century, the grouping was more on these are people or servants and not white. In the late 18th century, a lot of the records start calling Indians blacks and then colored. They actually Indians stops appearing in the records, and often the church records are calling people who we know are Wampanoag or Narragansett, are calling them black or colored. So there's sort of a blurring in the early 19th century in those records as well. Actually, in the 18th century, there's not a whole lot of good records on exactly where people sat, because most of the time they're concerned about paying attention to paying people, people who are paying pew rents. That's the records are concerned with people's ownership and the pew rents on the pews they own. So actually, in a lot of the records, there's almost no reference to where the people who are not paying are seating.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really great, really interesting. Well done.
Thank you.
So, Sarah Osborne, who had such a remarkable ministry in her home, she kept school in her house, and this interracial revival that took place, and accused of being, quote, keeping a Negro house because of the preponderance of African Americans that were there night after night and so on, and in the 1760s. So her pastor, Samuel Hopkins, publishes in 1776 this really significant anti-slavery tract in an auspicious year, 1776. And so to what extent do you think Samuel Hopkins, her pastor, and pastor of many of these African Americans, was influenced by them and by her, a woman, and to what extent was he following kind of the logic of the New Divinity theology started by Jonathan Edwards, who himself owned some slaves, but as you pointed out, Edwards Jr. Turned that around. Or is it a combination of things, seeing the logic of the theology pointing in this direction, kind of the arc of the theology playing out, plus the pressure of these actual real-life people? So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Catherine Breckus thinks that actually Sarah Osborne owned a slave as well. A young boy, and really a toddler, was given to her. And she didn't seem to develop an anti-slavery opinion until after Samuel Hopkins developed his anti-slavery opinion. So I think it's more her pastor influencing her. There was a huge blind spot we can see that from her point of view, that she didn't oppose slavery any earlier. There were African American members of Samuel Hopkins' church when he arrived. And he's coming into Newport, which is the center really of the slave trade in New England, center of the distilling industries, which are processing molasses from the Caribbean slave plantations. So scholars have made the case that this location is really crucial. You've seen full-blown slavery and its effects in Newport had an impact on him. It's difficult to know for sure, but I think the African American members of his church likely had a role, because there were already some when he joined. He admits more during his ministry, becomes close friends with Newport Gardner, close associate with Newport Gardner. So clearly without his theology, it's hard to imagine him becoming quite so forceful as he did, and clearly his theology played a role in how he articulated his anti-slavery. But I can't imagine it happening also without the context of Newport itself and the context of his church, where there are certainly black members. We will never know exactly what conversations he had with any of them. That's what I'm going to go with, yes. Thank you.
All right, well, I think, why don't we take one, I think we'll take one more question, and if you could just keep it brief, and that side, and then we'll close up. Thank you.
Could you share a little bit about why you were drawn to this topic and how it's changed you looking at all of these records?
I've been working on this for almost a decade now. It's been a long, long time. It started, I'll just very, very briefly, it started when I worked for the Park Service on the Black Heritage Trail, giving tours of Beacon Hill's 19th century abolition movement, and thinking about the 1805 meeting house. So I knew that this was the first black church in Boston, but I knew Boston has an old history. What about everything between 1630 and 1805? That was the starting question for me. And I didn't see a real good answer. I didn't see a convincing answer on were there very many black Christians before separate black churches, and so I started digging. And you'll notice I didn't talk about First or Second Baptist Church of Boston. First and Second Baptist of Boston didn't admit African Americans until the 1770s. So they weren't prominent in this, and it was very slow, but it picked up a lot of steam in the last decade of the 18th century. So it was that starting point that really, the initial question that led to this project, and then it ballooned into looking at more and more and more churches across the whole North. And for me, it really changes my perspective of New England's history. I think the ways that the religious history is far more interesting and far more complex for me. With this answer, the origins of African American Christianity in the North, I think, are more complex than what I had known before, and so I'm think for that reason it's been interesting for me, and I think an important contribution to our knowledge about the past. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming tonight.
I think we're going to do
one more.
I think we're going to do one more.
Okay.
One more
Thank you.
question.
It's not even a question. I wanted to amend. I left it. There were 3 parts. So Candy says that they're racists who are out and out racists. There's the assimilationists who say that if the Negro would take on white mannerisms and white culture, etc., they will become better, and then they can be part of the society. And then there's the third category, which I left out, which is the anti-racists and the people right from the beginning who saw that the Africans coming over were whole people in and of themselves, and that they were fine just the way they were. And so I just left that bit out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.